The personal resonance of the Kamagata-Maru for me has been quite difficult. I've always wrestled with the Kamagata-Maru. In school, we're taught the Kamagata-Maru story. And so for me, in my early days, I sort of veered away from the Kamagata-Maru because I felt it was this one story that had this sort of hegemonic hold on South Asian Canadian history in BC. And there were other stories that need to be told. And as I went to university to try to find other stories, I came to terms with the Kamagata-Maru as being a story that was important in its own right, but that could coexist with other equally important stories. I would say there are probably two root causes of racism in British Columbia. The first root cause is understanding that the racism in BC goes back a very long time. Vancouver in particular has a long history of racism that has to come to terms with. In a sense, it's always this ongoing struggle, it's always this ongoing battle of education, of communication, of learning about the histories of cooperation and disseminating that so there are these alternate narratives to when a knee-jerk reaction of racism exists, we can pull upon something else and say, no, there are other histories out there that can be told. The Kamagata-Maru landed on May 23rd, 1914, 99 years ago, and it landed and stayed in Burrard Inlet. It had 376 passengers on board, the majority of whom were of the Sikh faith. The Kamagata-Maru stayed in the harbor for 2 months for a variety of reasons. The major one was racism. As citizens of the larger empire, of the British Empire, the Kamagata-Maru passengers should have had access to come to Canada. However, Canada had a continuous regulation, continuous journey regulation, and that meant that people had to come from their country of origin in order to come to Canada. And because no continuous line from India to Canada existed at that time period, it was this subtle way of excluding Indians from coming to Canada. Now, it came to the harbor in Burrard Inlet, and it created commotion. There are some amazing pictures of the first day when the Kamagata-Maru arrived, because papers like The Sun and The Province at the time were covering their arrival and saying that this boat is coming, the ship will be arriving. And at the day it arrived, there was this huge, great crowd at the harbor to see the boat, and everyone was quite excited. So the Kamagata-Maru stayed there for 2 months, and slowly over that time period, rations started running low. They ran low on food and on fresh water. Whether it was exclusionary policies by the mayor, the premier, the prime minister at that time, not wanting the Kamagata-Maru to land, and that challenge to go through the courts. But the challenge did eventually go through the courts, and what happened was the Kamagata-Maru was judged to have broken the law, and it was sent back to India. The legacy of the Kamagata-Maru in terms of treating other passengers who've come by boat, perhaps illegally, I think there are some resonance here that we can learn from. One in particular is that when people come by boat, or when these so-called illegal immigrants do come to Canada, the Tamil example is perhaps the most recent in terms of migrants who come from Sri Lanka leaving the civil war that was taking place there. And I feel that some of them were treated quite unjustly in terms of their treatment and being put in detention camps here close to British Columbia. Their story, I think, resonates not so much in terms of the exclusion of the Kamagata-Maru, but in terms of the racism, in terms of the hyper-surveillance of the world today, in terms of those elements that weren't around during Kamagata-Maru time, but those still some of those same assumptions that are made about communities around the world when they come to Canada, and the automatic assumption of racism that still needs to be dealt with. Issues of racism, I think, haven't been too strong for me. When I look back at these stories told by the pioneer communities, racism was very overt. You can't have this job, you can't go to this school, you can't buy a home here, you can't vote. A lot of those restrictions were quite overt. The racism now is a bit more subtle, and it infiltrates its way in different discourses, whether it's discourses around gang violence or crime or other things along those lines. There's a difference between having an ethnic enclave and having a neighborhood, for instance. Those are subtle differences that perhaps are lost in terms of racism and the discourses of the community.
My name is Harry Baines. I'm the MLA for Surrey Newton and the Minister of Labour. I have been living in Surrey since 1978. First it was in Whalley and now in Newton. love it here. My children were born and raised here, and they went to the local school system, and they're on their own now, and I'm here. South Asians, largely Punjabi. I think they started in Vancouver and Victoria, the beginning of the past century. And things were not as welcoming at that time for them and many other visible minorities like Chinese and Japanese and even our First Nations. There were laws being passed in Victoria. I think there are something like 139 laws that you can today call them discriminatory and racist laws. They were passed in Victoria. Some prominent areas of those legislation was denying the right to Chinese and Japanese and First Nations in 1895, I believe it was, to vote and defranchise them. And then South Asians, who were called Hindus, in the legislation they're called Hindus, were added to that list in 1907. So when I was elected in 2005 and being interested in history and what are the people who came here before us, what they went through, what the labor history was. I mean, that was a part of that. Went to the library and asked them to give me the procedures of 1907 in the legislature of Victoria, the speeches and the legislation itself. It was quite eye-opener. Not surprising, because knowing a little bit of a history, how discrimination was wide open and how people were treated. It's a bit of a checkered history that we have in British Columbia with otherwise beautiful history in Canada and the making up of Canada and the role that the British Columbia and British Columbians played. But that part is very checkered. And so there are speeches being made in the House by the Minister of Labor why Hindus should be kept off the voters list. Very derogatory, and I hate to repeat them here, but perhaps they should be repeated so that people know what was being talked about them and the people who came before us. Language such as the Hindus are cheaters, dishonest, dirty, and they will never be able to mix in our society. They'd never be able to establish. And then the opposition, person standing up, saying, yes, but we should go further. And suggestion was that those who are here, yes, we should deny them equal rights, but we should find a ways to settle them in some other South American countries. Take them all out and stop, more to come to, or allow them to come to Canada. So that was the language being spoken in the House by the government minister and the opposition. And after the debate, unanimously, that motion was passed. There were only liberals and conservatives in the House at that time. So when I read that, and when July of 2017, Premier John Horgan appointed me Minister of Labor, I walked and I occupied that chair. It reflected back on me that someone who sat and occupied this chair made those remarks. And how far we have come, thanks to many who came before us, both in our community but also the wider community, with progressive minds and progressive approaches, how they work together with these visible minorities to give us today the right to equally participate in the system. Not only that I am occupying the same chair where a minister before me, 100-some years ago, said people that look like me should never be allowed to come to country, never mind coming into this house to represent the rest of the population. That now I am making laws for the rest of British Columbians. How fulfilling, number one, that is, and also the progress that the people who came before us have made. So I think that is quite telling, and I every day pinch myself when I wake up. Is this real possible? Is this reality? Where a government was talking about keeping people like me out of this province, this country, those who are here, denying them equal rights to participate in the electoral system, denying them right to vote, denying them to have the right to purchase property in certain part of certain cities in Lower Mainland. I say my head bows to those who came before us to give me the opportunity, give all the people who came before me from all different countries, the multiculturalism that we have adopted in this country, the different customs, the traditions that they all brought with them, the entrepreneurship spirit that they brought with them, the activism, the spirit of activism that they brought with them, is the reason that we find today unity in diversity, only in Canada, only in British Columbia. So I think that's one side of it. The other side of it is that being an immigrant, I was about 18 when I first came to Canada, born in a very modest family in a small village, where you cannot even think about occupying elected position unless you were born into those type of families or you have a lot of money and you have influence. That you come to Canada, you overcome your language deficiencies, you overcome the cultural deficiencies or the diversity of cultural values. You go through that, you learn all that, adopt them, and fellow Canadians elect you to represent them in just such a short period of time. Is amazing. Only in Canada that could happen. Only in Canada.